When I saw him standing at the doorway, holding the crumpled letter I had written but never meant to send, my breath caught, not because I feared his anger, but because that letter carried the part of me I'd been hiding for months. The part that whispered of loneliness and longing and choices I hadn't dared to make out loud. He looked at me, confusion tightening the lines of his face, and held the letter up as if it were evidence. My hands shook as I reached for it, but he pulled back just enough, the paper trembling between us. I stared at his eyes as they skimmed each word, watching his expression shift from disbelief to something darker, more fragile. He didn't say a word, he didn't need to. My stomach dropped as he turned to the last paragraph, the one where I'd written about him, about the young man who had changed everything, about the quiet afternoons that had turned into dangerous evenings. My throat was dry, my heart beating so loud I thought he might hear it. I'd written that letter 3 months ago, back when I thought I could keep the secret neatly folded in the drawer of my mind. I never mailed it, never burned it, never even read it again. And yet here it was, in his hands, unraveling my world word by word. His lips parted slightly, like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words, and that silence felt heavier than any accusation. My own breath felt foreign, shallow, and I bit the inside of my cheek the way I do when panic crawls under my skin. This was the moment I'd feared, the collision between what I had been hiding and the life I had been pretending to live. But before I tell you how he found that letter, and what I wrote in it, let me take you back to the day it all began, to the moment that turned my carefully ordered life upside down. I used to think my life was quietly unremarkable, like an old photograph in a frame nobody dusts anymore. There was comfort in that stillness, or at least that's what I told myself on mornings when I set the same chipped mug on the table and waited for the kettle to hiss. My marriage wasn't broken, not in the way people like to imagine, no shouting matches, no slammed doors. It was a softer kind of absence, the kind that crept in over years like ivy swallowing the walls of a house. My husband would sit across from me, reading his newspaper, his eyes flicking up only when he needed the butter or the salt. There was no anger in those glances, just nothing. And that nothing began to feel louder than words ever could. Some mornings I'd catch my reflection in the kitchen window, my hair hastily pinned back, my skin a little duller than I remembered, and I'd feel like I was looking at a woman in someone else's life. Not unhappy, exactly. Just faded. I wasn't sure when I'd stopped wearing perfume or choosing earrings to match my blouse. Somewhere between grocery lists and laundry cycles, I had quietly set those parts of myself aside. The house itself seemed to mirror that stillness. Little things had started to give way, a door that stuck in the hallway, a window that refused to shut tight in the back room. My husband mentioned calling someone to fix them once or twice, then dropped the subject, too absorbed in work to remember. I let the inconveniences pile up. Maybe, deep down, I liked the idea of something, or someone, coming in to fix the things we'd let fall apart. The day he arrived, it wasn't a grand entrance, just a knock at the door and a muffled hello. He couldn't have been more than 21, maybe 22. Young enough that I noticed the contrast immediately. His face still carried that careless ease of someone who hadn't learned to brace himself against life yet. He introduced himself with a smile that reached his eyes and asked about the work, the window, the hinges, the things I'd almost stopped noticing. I nodded, feeling an unexpected flutter in my chest that I dismissed as surprise. He moved around the house with an energy that made me strangely self-conscious. He measured, drilled, asked me where I wanted things tightened or replaced, as if my preferences mattered. When he crouched near the window frame to check the seal, his hand brushed the curtain and for a moment I thought about how long it had been since anyone's movements in this house felt unpracticed, unscripted. I found myself offering him tea, not out of politeness, but because I wanted to keep him there a little longer. We talked as he worked. Nothing serious at first, about the weather, the traffic, the price of tools. But there was something about the way he listened, leaning in slightly, that made even those scraps of conversation feel different. He asked questions like he actually wanted the answers. When I mentioned how the window had been sticking for months, he grinned and said, "Well, that's an easy fix." And for some reason, that simple assurance made me feel lighter, as if he wasn't just talking about the window. By the time he left that first afternoon, the room felt different. Warmer, somehow. I stood in the doorway after he drove away, holding my own hand against the wood frame he'd tightened, as if I could still feel the echo of his presence. I told myself it was nothing, just the novelty of someone new in the house, someone who didn't look at me and see routine. But later, when my husband asked over dinner if the repairs were done, I nodded and kept my eyes on my plate. Because even then, before anything happened, before I even understood what I was feeling, I already knew this wasn't just about the window. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined everything, that flicker of something when he stood in the hallway, the way my chest had tightened when he smiled. I folded laundry as if folding could smooth out the unease inside me. I tried to focus on the ordinary rhythm of the day, the whir of the washing machine, the quiet scrape of a knife against toast, the hum of my husband's voice as he left a reminder about dinner before heading out the door. But when the knock came again, soft and almost casual, I knew who it was before I even reached the door. There he stood, a paper bag in one hand, a small toolbox in the other. "I thought I'd stop by," he said, his voice light. "Just to make sure the window's holding." It was an excuse, an unnecessary check, a reason to be here again, and I understood that immediately. I stepped aside, letting him in, aware of the way the morning light fell on the kitchen tiles, sharper than usual. He set the bag on the counter, and when I opened it, there were 2 cups of coffee and a couple of pastries, the kind from the bakery down the road. It was a small gesture, almost ordinary, but I felt the air shift when he handed me the cup. The warmth of it lingered against my palm as if it carried more than just coffee. I thanked him, trying to keep my voice even, but I could feel a strange weight settling in my chest, a mix of gratitude and something I didn't dare name. He walked through the rooms again, running his hand along the doorframe, crouching by the window he had fixed the day before. I watched him from the corner of the kitchen, noticing details I hadn't before, the way his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal his forearms, the unhurried way he moved, the way his hair fell forward when he leaned down. We talked, though the words were almost background noise to the quiet tension between us. He asked about the age of the house, the paint in the hallway, the plants by the window. I answered, my voice steadier than I felt, but my thoughts scattered like loose pages. When he moved to the back room, I followed, not because I needed to, but because I didn't want to stay behind. He knelt to tighten a hinge, and I stood near the doorframe, feeling oddly exposed in my own house. There was a pause, not an awkward one, but the kind that hums with something unsaid. He looked up at me, his eyes catching mine. It wasn't a long look, just long enough for me to forget what I'd meant to say. My breath caught, not dramatically, not so he could see, but enough that I felt it. He stood slowly, closing the space between us just slightly, and in that stillness, the distance between yesterday and today vanished. We didn't speak. There wasn't a conversation to explain or justify anything. His hand brushed mine, not by accident, not by design, just the kind of touch that happens when neither person moves away. And then it happened, sudden and quiet, as if it was the only thing that could have happened in that moment, **** we kissed ****. It was brief, almost hesitant, but the impact of it lingered like a tremor in my chest. I felt my whole body go still, as if moving would undo what just happened. When he stepped back, there was no apology in his eyes, only a question he didn't ask aloud. I stood there, my hand brushing against my lips as if to confirm it had been real. The room looked the same, but I didn't feel the same standing in it. He turned back to the hinge, working again as though nothing had shifted, but everything had. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee still warm, untouched. I stared at the doorway, replaying it over and over, not because I wanted to savor it, but because I couldn't quite believe it. I didn't tell myself it was nothing. I couldn't lie that well to myself. But I told myself it could stay contained, tucked away like a folded letter no one would ever read. I told myself it was just a moment. A mistake. But even as I said that, even as I tried to believe it, I knew something had been set in motion that couldn't be undone. The day after the kiss unfolded in fragments, as though the ordinary rhythms of life had been broken into uneven pieces. I moved through the motions, folding laundry, rinsing dishes, making tea, yet every small action felt disconnected, like my body was performing tasks while my mind played a different reel entirely. That moment in the back room replayed again and again, the unplanned brush of his hand, the quiet stillness before it happened, and then the fact that it had. I told myself that life could simply resume, that yesterday's slip could vanish into the blur of ordinary days. But even in that morning's silence, I felt the sharp edge of something new. Every room in the house seemed to hold a trace of him, the chair he'd rested his jacket on, the window he had adjusted, even the faint scent of coffee from the cup he had left behind. These weren't just objects anymore, they were reminders, like breadcrumbs leading me back to a thought I shouldn't follow. When the phone rang just after noon, my heart jolted before I even reached for it. I didn't expect it to be him, not really, and yet when I heard his voice, low and careful, I wasn't surprised. He said he'd found another small repair that needed doing, the door on the back porch, the one that had been sticking for months. He spoke as if it were purely practical, and I listened as if it were purely practical, but we both knew better. He mentioned the door again, almost casually, and then said something that caught me off guard. I could take a look on the way to the coast this weekend, there's a small job I have out there. It wouldn't be any trouble. The words hung between us. They weren't loaded, not overtly, but they carried more weight than they should have. A trip to the coast. A simple repair. Or maybe not so simple. I could have said no. I told myself that as I stood there, the phone still warm against my ear. But the truth is, I didn't even hesitate long enough to make that refusal convincing. I heard myself say yes, my voice steady, though my pulse was not. Later that evening, I found myself pulling open drawers, not for anything in particular but just to see what was there. I touched the edges of folded sweaters, smoothed my fingers over a scarf I hadn't worn in years. When was the last time I thought about what I wore for my own sake? When was the last time I wanted to? I packed lightly, telling myself it wasn't packing at all, just gathering a few things for a trip. A sweater for the cool air, a book I probably wouldn't open, a pair of shoes that weren't meant for work around the house. Each item slipped into the bag quietly, yet each felt like a choice, a step in a direction I wasn't ready to name. The morning we left, the house felt unusually still. My husband's voice drifted from the other room as he reminded me about errands he'd run later. He didn't ask where I was going, not really, he assumed it was nothing more than a casual outing. I let him assume. The drive began in a comfortable kind of quiet. He focused on the road, and I watched the landscape shift from familiar streets to stretches of highway. Trees blurred by, their leaves flashing green and gold, and I thought about how far from home we were headed, though it wasn't only miles I was measuring. He talked a little, enough to fill the space without crowding it, about the repairs he had planned, about the weather on the coast. His words weren't remarkable, but there was an ease in the way he spoke, unguarded and warm. I found myself watching his hands on the wheel, the way his fingers tapped lightly against it when music played faintly from the radio. Every few miles, my mind would circle back to the question I didn't want to answer: why was I here? I could tell myself it was about the door, about fixing what was broken, but that explanation didn't quite hold. There was something else, something unspoken, that tugged me forward, that made the road feel like a line being drawn between who I had been and who I might become. The air changed as we neared the coast. It was cooler, carrying a hint of salt that clung to the windows when we rolled them down. I felt that air against my face, and for a moment, I forgot to think at all. When we finally pulled up to the small house near the water, it wasn't anything extraordinary, a plain porch, faded paint, a door that did indeed stick when he tested it. But standing there, I felt a strange rush, as if simply arriving had shifted something in me. He unloaded his tools, the familiar scrape of metal on wood filling the space between us. I followed him inside, telling myself I was just being polite, though we both knew politeness wasn't why I had agreed to come. He worked while I watched, not in a way that would draw attention, but in a way that let me take in every detail, the concentration on his face as he adjusted the hinge, the quick brush of his hand over his forehead, the ease with which he moved in a space that wasn't his. There was no moment of confession, no words to explain why we were there together. Instead, there was the sound of the door easing open smoothly, the faint creak finally gone, and the quiet satisfaction on his face as he turned to me and said simply, "There. Fixed." But as I stood there, watching him close his toolbox, I realized the door wasn't the only thing that had shifted. Something inside me had too, and no amount of hinges or screws could hold it in place again. The first thing I noticed about the coast was how the air itself seemed to press against me differently. It wasn't just the salt, it was the way the wind carried an energy that felt both calming and unsettling, like it knew something I didn't. When we stepped out of the truck, the horizon stretched endlessly, the sea a muted gray-blue under the pale sky. The house we had come to work on stood quietly against it all, weathered by time and storms, and I couldn't help but think about how people, too, could be worn down like this, their edges softened until they were almost unrecognizable. He carried his tools toward the porch, and I followed, my shoes crunching softly against the gravel path. The door groaned when he touched it, as if it resented being moved, and for a strange moment I felt the sound settle deep in my chest. He glanced back at me with a half-smile, almost teasing, as if to say, "See, you weren't wrong, it really does need me." That look alone carried something more potent than I wanted to admit. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and salt water, a mix that was oddly comforting. I ran my fingers along the windowsill, feeling the grit of sand that had blown in and stayed. He set down his toolbox, knelt by the door, and began to work without ceremony. The sound of metal scraping against wood filled the space between us, steady and familiar. I leaned against the frame, watching him. Not in an obvious way, I didn't want to make it strange, but my eyes traced the motion of his hands, the deliberate way he tested the screws and hinges. I noticed the way the fabric of his shirt stretched when he reached, how easily he occupied the space. And then, without meaning to, I noticed my own breathing had slowed, like my body was listening to something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. We didn't talk much at first, just a few words about the work, the weather, the way the ocean wind might warp the wood. But even those scraps of conversation felt oddly weighted, as if there was more in them than what we were saying aloud. At one point, he asked if I could hold the door steady while he tested the frame, and I stepped forward, my hands pressing lightly against the wood. Our fingers brushed when he reached for the latch, and though it lasted only a second, the heat of it stayed. I found myself asking questions just to fill the quiet, where he'd learned to do this kind of work, how long he'd been driving out to the coast for jobs like this. He answered easily, his voice low, unhurried. There was no rush in him, no guardedness. He told me he liked the coast jobs, that they felt different somehow, and I found myself agreeing without really knowing why. When the door finally swung open without a creak, he leaned back on his heels with a look of quiet satisfaction. "Better," he said simply, wiping his hands on a cloth. I nodded, but my gaze stayed on him a moment longer than it should have. There was something grounding in watching him fix something tangible, something I could see and hear. It was such a contrast to the things in my life that felt unfixable. We stepped outside for air, and the late afternoon light made everything softer, the lines of the house, the roughness of the yard, even the jagged edges of the coastline in the distance. He sat on the edge of the porch, resting his elbows on his knees, and I joined him, though I kept a careful inch or two of space between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the wind, the distant crash of waves, the creak of the newly fixed door when it moved slightly in its frame. I stared at the horizon, but I was more aware of the way he sat beside me, the occasional shift of his weight, the way his arm brushed the air close to mine when he adjusted his position. He made a passing comment about how the sea air would probably undo his work in a year or two, and I laughed lightly, though the sound surprised me. I couldn't remember the last time laughter came so easily, so unforced. The sun dipped lower, throwing gold across the porch, and the silence between us shifted. It wasn't awkward, it was something else, a kind of pause that hummed with meaning. I could feel my heart beating a little faster, though I wasn't sure why. I thought of my husband then, just for a moment, as if checking the boundaries of my own thoughts. I pictured him at home, moving through the rooms as he always did, unaware of where I was sitting, of who was sitting next to me. The guilt that came with that thought was sharp, but so was the strange sense of freedom. I didn't move closer, and neither did he. But as we sat there, watching the horizon swallow the last of the sun, it felt like something had shifted again, not a sudden change, but the kind you only recognize later, when you look back and see the line you crossed without noticing. When he finally stood, brushing the dust from his hands, I followed him inside. He packed his tools with the same easy movements, and I told myself we were just two people finishing a job. That was all. But as I glanced at the door, fixed, smooth, quiet now, I couldn't shake the thought that the house had been altered, and so had I. The sun was already low when he finished packing his tools, the light outside shifting from gold to that muted gray that comes before evening fully settles. I stood near the door, my hands resting lightly on the frame, and watched him move through the quiet, deliberate process of tucking away each piece of equipment. It struck me, strangely, how methodical he was, how everything had its place, how nothing felt rushed. It contrasted so sharply with the disarray inside my own mind. The air outside had cooled, and when he stepped out onto the porch, I followed, more out of instinct than decision. He looked out toward the narrow path that led down to the beach and said he wanted to take a walk before driving back. He said it casually, almost as if he were talking to himself, but I heard the unspoken invitation in it. I nodded, and together we stepped off the porch and onto the sand-packed trail. The wind was softer by the water, and the sky was wide and open, streaked with the last colors of the day. The beach wasn't crowded, it wasn't the kind of place people came for vacation photos or noisy picnics. It was quiet, with only a few scattered footprints leading nowhere in particular. We walked without speaking for a while, the sound of the waves filling the space between us. My shoes sank slightly with each step, and I felt the damp grit of sand creeping over the edges. He had his hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted as though listening to the tide. There was no urgency in his movements, no expectation, and yet the silence between us felt charged, like the air before a storm. I found myself looking at him sideways, catching glimpses of his profile, the way the wind caught in his hair, the relaxed curve of his shoulders. It wasn't that I hadn't noticed him before, I had, but now, walking side by side in this strange half-light, the noticing felt heavier. We stopped at the edge of the water, where the waves lapped at the sand and then retreated, leaving faint traces of foam. He bent down, picked up a flat stone, and skimmed it across the surface. It skipped twice before sinking. He smiled to himself, a small, almost childlike smile, and I realized how long it had been since anyone around me did something so simple, so uncalculated. I sat on a piece of driftwood, and he joined me, brushing sand from the edge before sitting. The tide moved in slow breaths, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had slowed to match it. He spoke first, something light, about how the ocean air made him feel awake, about how repairs near the coast were his favorite because they felt different. His words were ordinary, but there was something in the way he said them that pulled me in, made me want to listen more closely than the words demanded. I said something in return, I couldn't even remember what later, but I do remember the way he turned slightly toward me when I spoke, as if my words mattered. There was a pause, and then another, the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable but left my heart beating a little harder. The last light of the sunset painted everything softer, the line of his jaw, the texture of the sand, even the restless movement of the water. He reached into the bag he had brought and pulled out 2 small ice cream cups, the kind you buy from a stand you almost forget is there. They were melting in the truck, he said, with that same easy half-smile. It was a silly gesture, but somehow it felt bigger than that. I took one, the cold of it sharp against my hands, and for a moment I felt absurdly young, as though I were on some awkward summer outing years ago. We ate quietly, the sound of the spoons scraping against the paper cups mixing with the sound of the waves. When I finished mine, I set it aside on the driftwood and looked at him. He wasn't staring at me, but he wasn't looking away either. His gaze held steady, and I felt that same jolt I had felt the day before in the back room, only stronger now, clearer. There was no long build-up, no overthinking. We didn't talk about what was right or wrong. There wasn't even a moment of hesitation this time, just that quiet inevitability as the distance between us closed. We kissed. It wasn't tentative, not like the first time. It was still quiet, still simple, but it felt more certain, like something that had been waiting, like something neither of us could pretend hadn't been coming. When it ended, I sat back slightly, my breath uneven. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound too small. The waves kept moving, the sand cooling beneath our feet, the ice cream cups forgotten beside us. I thought about my husband then, not sharply, not as a rebuke, but as a fact. He was at home, probably finishing dinner, probably not wondering where I was. The thought came and went like a shadow across the sand, and I didn't push it away, but I didn't linger on it either. We sat there until the last light of the day was gone, until the grayness settled fully and the air turned cold enough that we both stood without needing to agree. The walk back to the house was quiet again, but the quiet had changed. It wasn't the easy, careless silence from before. It was heavier, full of something unspoken and undeniable. When we reached the porch, he picked up his tools, and I followed him inside. He didn't say much as he gathered his things for the drive back. I didn't either. But as he stood in the doorway, his hand brushing against the frame the way mine had earlier, he glanced back at me with that same half-smile, and it felt like a promise, or maybe just the beginning of one. And when he left, and I stood alone in the cooling air, I realized that nothing about this could ever be folded neatly away again. The drive back from the coast felt longer than the drive there, though the route was the same and the scenery unchanged. I sat in the passenger seat with the window cracked, letting the cool air spill in, but it didn't clear my head the way I hoped it would. I watched the blur of trees and road signs and tried to force my thoughts into neat boxes, what happened on the porch, what happened on the beach, what it all meant, but nothing stayed contained for long. By the time we reached my street, dusk had settled into that in-between shade that made the world look muted, almost suspended. He slowed the truck near my driveway, and I felt my hand tighten around the strap of my bag. We didn't speak much, only a few brief words about when he'd check on the door again, about how the weather might hold through the weekend. It sounded casual, but every sentence felt heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. When I stepped out, I didn't look back right away. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel, the distant hum of his truck fading, and only then did I turn to see the last glimpse of it disappearing down the road. My house stood quiet, exactly as I'd left it, yet it felt different now, as though the walls somehow knew something had shifted in me. I pushed open the door and stepped into the familiar dimness of the hallway. The smell of dinner lingered faintly in the air, roasted vegetables, bread, the kind of simple meal my husband made when I wasn't home. I set my bag down on the counter and stood there for a long moment, staring at the space where he'd left the loaf cooling. The ordinary scene was almost too sharp in contrast to the day I had just lived. My husband was in the living room, the television casting flickering light across his face. He looked up when I walked in. "You're back late," he said, not accusatory, not even curious, just a statement. I nodded, my voice catching slightly when I said something about traffic, about how the job had taken longer than expected. He didn't press. He just nodded and turned back to the screen, his attention already drifting elsewhere. That indifference hit me harder than any suspicion could have. If he'd asked questions, if he'd searched my face for answers, I might have been forced to confront the truth of what I was doing. But his easy acceptance, his lack of doubt, felt like a door quietly closing between us. I moved through the evening like a shadow, washing my hands at the sink, folding a stray towel, rinsing a glass in the kitchen. My movements were automatic, but my mind kept slipping away, circling back to the same images, the faint smile on the porch, the touch of his hand brushing mine when we walked, the second kiss on the beach that still burned somewhere under my skin. Later, when the house was quiet and my husband had gone to bed, I sat in the darkened kitchen with only the hum of the refrigerator for company. I stared at the empty mug in front of me, my fingers tracing its rim, and I wondered how something as small as a moment could create such a fracture. The next morning was worse in its simplicity. Breakfast passed without incident, eggs, toast, the scrape of cutlery, the usual routine. He asked how I slept, and I said fine, the word catching in my throat for just a second too long. He didn't notice, or maybe he pretended not to. When the phone rang mid-morning, I felt the jolt before I even checked the screen. It was him. His voice was quiet, almost careful, when he asked if the door was still closing smoothly, if the window latch he'd adjusted last week was holding. The questions were mundane, but each one felt like a thread pulling me back to the day before, to the beach, to the unspoken thing between us. We didn't talk long, but when I hung up, the house felt different again, like a room you've just left and returned to, still carrying the echo of a conversation. I tried to throw myself into ordinary tasks, laundry, bills, a grocery list, but my mind refused to settle. Every song on the radio, every faint scent of salt on my jacket from the coast, every thought of the door we'd fixed brought me back to him. The guilt came in waves. Sometimes sharp, almost cutting. Other times softer, like a background hum I couldn't quite tune out. I thought of my husband, of how he moved through the house with the same quiet efficiency he always had, unaware, or unwilling to be aware, of the storm in my head. But beneath that guilt was something else, something I was afraid to name. A pull. A warmth that crept in when I remembered his voice, his easy smile, the way he looked at me, not with obligation, not with habit, but with an attention I hadn't felt in years. I told myself to stop thinking about it, but even as I made that promise, I knew I wouldn't keep it. By evening, the light outside turned that pale shade of gold again, and I stood by the window, staring at the street, wondering if his truck might appear. Wondering if I wanted it to. Wondering what I would do if it did. The truth was, the part of me that used to believe in simple lines, right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, was blurring. And as I stood there, hands pressed against the cool glass, I knew one thing with an unsettling certainty: what had started as a single crack in the surface of my life had already widened, and there was no way to pretend it wasn't there anymore. The following days blurred, a quiet stretch of ordinary tasks threaded with something that wasn't ordinary at all. I told myself I wouldn't see him again soon, that time and distance might dull the sharpness of what I felt. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that silence doesn't erase anything, it only makes the sound louder when it finally breaks. He called late in the afternoon, his voice carrying that same casual tone he used when asking about repairs, but I could hear the pause underneath it, the hesitation before his words. He asked if I'd be home the next evening, if he could stop by, not to fix anything, not even pretending this time. I hesitated, holding the phone too tightly, my thumb hovering over the edge. The easy answer would have been no. But easy answers had slipped out of my reach. I said yes, my voice low, almost steady, though my pulse betrayed me. The day he came felt different from the moment I woke. The sunlight seemed brighter, almost intrusive, spilling into every corner of the house. Every ordinary movement, setting down a mug, folding a towel, felt deliberate, as though I were aware of being seen even before anyone arrived. When I heard his truck in the driveway, my breath caught, just for an instant. The sound of the door closing, the crunch of his footsteps on the gravel, the soft knock, all of it felt amplified. I opened the door, and there he stood, not carrying tools this time, not holding anything at all. We didn't say much at first. Words weren't the point. He stepped inside, and the space between us felt smaller than it had ever been. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. We didn't sit in the kitchen or linger in the doorway, we moved almost without thinking, finding the one room in the house where the light was softer, where the walls felt closer. There was no long conversation, no careful explanation. The truth was already written in the days leading up to this moment, in the beach, in the two kisses that couldn't be undone, in the silence we both understood. We didn't name what happened next, because naming it would have made it smaller, would have tried to fit it into neat lines that didn't exist anymore. We spent the night together. The hours blurred, not in the way of a dream, but in the way of something too present, too real, for time to hold on to. By morning, the light crept in through the blinds, soft and unrelenting. He was asleep, his breathing even, his body loose with the kind of rest that comes easily to the young. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the night press down in waves. There was no denying what had happened, no pretending I could fold it away like laundry or tuck it into a drawer. The room smelled faintly of him, of us, and that scent alone felt like a confession. I slipped out of bed quietly, gathering my clothes with a care that made my hands shake. The floor was cool under my bare feet as I crossed to the window and looked out at the pale sky. The guilt was there, sharp as glass, cutting against the edges of my thoughts. But so was something else, a raw, unfiltered awareness that something had been woken in me, something that couldn't be put back to sleep. He stirred as I pulled on my sweater, his eyes opening slowly, unfocused for a moment before finding me. There was no awkwardness in his gaze, no hesitation, only a quiet that said more than words. I smiled faintly, though it felt fragile, and said I should make coffee. My voice didn't quite sound like my own. The kitchen felt like another world that morning, the same counters and mugs, but different now, as though every surface carried a secret. I filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and stared at the steam rising as if it might carry away the heaviness pressing into my chest. When he walked in, the light from the window caught on his hair, and for a brief, fleeting second, I felt something close to peace. But then the clock on the wall ticked louder in my ears, and the peace cracked. We didn't talk much as we drank our coffee. Small words, practical ones, how he'd drive back, how he had work later. None of it mattered, but it filled the space. When he left, he didn't linger at the door. He stepped outside into the cold morning, and I stood in the doorway watching him go. The truck pulled away, the sound fading down the street, leaving the silence behind. I turned back to the house, to the rooms that had been ordinary and were ordinary no longer. And I stood there, my hand resting on the frame of the door he'd closed behind him, knowing that whatever came next, nothing would return to what it had been before. The morning after he left felt unreal, as though the air itself had thickened overnight. The light coming through the blinds was too bright, too sharp, cutting across the floor in long white lines that made me squint. The house smelled of coffee and laundry detergent, the same as always, but every familiar scent felt foreign now, like I was standing in a set built to look like my life, rather than the life itself. I moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if my own footsteps might reveal me. Each sound, a drawer opening, a cup set down on the counter, seemed too loud. I kept expecting the walls to answer back, to accuse me, but they stayed silent. When I passed the mirror in the hallway, I stopped without meaning to. The woman who looked back at me wasn't someone I fully recognized. Her hair was a little messy, her eyes a little darker, her face not flushed but somehow altered. I touched my cheek as if the glass might offer an explanation. The guilt came in fragments, sharp and uninvited. It wasn't a single wave that washed over me, it was a dozen little cuts, catching me when I reached for the kettle, when I saw the familiar coat hanging by the door, when I thought about the bed I'd left rumpled. My husband moved through the house that morning in his usual way. He stood at the sink rinsing his mug, his face unreadable, the same quiet presence it had always been. He asked if I'd be out later, his voice neutral, the kind of question that expected no real explanation. I answered with words that were simple and safe, "I'm not sure yet," and he nodded, satisfied or indifferent, I couldn't tell which. That indifference felt heavier than confrontation would have. It was as if he had decided long ago not to look too closely, and I had quietly learned to live in that space. The day stretched long. I busied myself with things that didn't need doing, organizing drawers, wiping counters that were already clean, moving objects from one place to another as though rearranging them could rearrange my thoughts. But nothing really filled the hours. Every empty corner of the house seemed to hold the memory of the night before. I tried to tell myself to stay still, to let time pass and settle things, but stillness was impossible. The phone on the counter felt like an anchor and a threat all at once. Each time it lit up, my heart caught, even when it wasn't him, especially when it wasn't him. By the afternoon, I found myself pacing the kitchen. The table, the chairs, the familiar hum of the refrigerator, they were the same, but they felt like props in a play I no longer believed in. When the phone finally did ring and his name lit the screen, I didn't hesitate. I answered too quickly, my voice catching just slightly when I said hello. His voice was calm, almost careful, as if he knew what words could do now. He didn't ask if I was all right, but the question was there, tucked into the spaces between sentences. He talked about ordinary things first, the door at the coast, another job he had later in the week, as though he were testing the air before stepping into it. I listened, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, the cool wood grounding me. When he finally paused, there was a silence that said more than the words he hadn't used. After we hung up, the house felt too quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. It wasn't the hollow, indifferent stillness of an empty space, it was heavier, like the pause after someone has said something they can't take back. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the heater filling the silence. I thought about his voice, about the way he had looked at me in the doorway when he left. I thought about my husband, his steady breathing in the next room, his quietness, his distance. The conflict twisted inside me. Guilt pressed hard, but alongside it, there was something else, a pull that was softer but just as powerful, a quiet insistence that something had been woken that couldn't simply be put away. In the dark, I tried to remember when exactly I had crossed the line, when the first step toward this had been taken. Was it when I let him into the house the first time? When our hands brushed near the window? When we kissed by the water? Or was it earlier, in the slow years of silence and routine that had softened me into someone I didn't recognize? By morning, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The kitchen smelled like toast, the paper was folded neatly on the counter, and my husband moved through the rooms as he always did. But I felt like a stranger in the scene. I realized, with a kind of dull clarity, that there was no way to go back. There was only forward, whatever that meant, whatever it would cost. The morning unfolded like so many others, but it felt as though I was moving through glass, everything visible, yet strangely muted. I made coffee, watched the steam rise in pale ribbons, and listened to the low hum of the house, but nothing could quiet the restlessness running beneath my skin. My husband read the paper across the table, flipping pages with that same calm rhythm he always had. He asked about errands, about dinner, his voice flat, ordinary, and all I could hear in it was how little he suspected. That absence of suspicion felt almost unbearable. I moved through the motions of the day, but every movement was layered with thoughts I couldn't switch off. The night with him sat heavy inside me, not as a single memory but as a series of moments, his voice, the quiet of the house, the way the morning light had looked when it fell across the floor. Those pieces looped over and over, a silent confession I carried everywhere. By midday, I found myself pulling out a suitcase, not because I had somewhere to go but because I needed to do something, anything, to make sense of the storm in my head. My hands moved on autopilot, folding clothes, sliding them into neat piles, as though packing them might also pack away the confusion. A sweater I hadn't worn in months. A pair of shoes I rarely touched. A scarf I didn't really need. Each item made the bag heavier, and somehow, so did the guilt. The suitcase sat open on the bed, half-filled and accusing. I stared at it, my hands resting on the edge, and tried to name what I was doing. Leaving? Escaping? Running? The words all felt too big and too small at once. By the time the afternoon stretched thin, I knew I couldn't just sit in the house anymore. The walls felt closer with every passing hour. I slipped on a coat, grabbed my bag, and left a note on the counter, nothing dramatic, just a line about needing air, about needing to clear my head. The drive to the station felt longer than it should have, the road blurring under the wheels. I parked in a spot I didn't have to think about and walked through the lot, dragging the suitcase behind me. The sound of its wheels against the pavement felt loud in the open air, an announcement I didn't want anyone to hear. Inside the station, the air was different, humming, crowded, thick with voices and footsteps and the clatter of bags. The smell of coffee and metal and too many people pressed in from every side. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next, letting the noise wash over me. I bought a ticket without thinking, my hand moving before my mind caught up. The paper felt thin between my fingers, lighter than it should have been. I stared at the printed letters, the destination a place I didn't even fully remember choosing. It didn't matter where, it was the leaving that mattered. I sat on a bench, the suitcase by my feet, and looked around at the faces moving past me. A couple arguing softly near the coffee kiosk. A mother calming a restless child. A man in a suit scrolling through his phone. All of them caught up in their own worlds, all of them not seeing me, and yet I felt exposed, as if they could all tell what I'd done, what I was about to do. My fingers tightened around the ticket, crumpling the edge slightly. I thought about the house I'd just left. About my husband, probably still reading in the chair by the window, unaware that his life had tilted without him knowing. I thought about the young man, his voice, the look in his eyes when he left the other morning. The guilt stabbed sharper now, not in a single blow but in tiny, relentless cuts. But there was something else too, pressing beneath it, a strange sense of choice, of standing on a line and knowing I could step either way. I looked down at the suitcase, at the ticket in my hand, and felt the sting of tears rise uninvited. Not because of him. Not even because of my husband. But because of me, because I didn't know who I was in that moment, someone leaving or someone returning. A man brushed past me, his shoulder barely touching mine, and the ticket slipped slightly from my fingers. He muttered a quick apology, already gone before I could answer. And somehow, that small, ordinary touch jolted something in me, the way the sound of a snapped twig tells you the forest isn't empty. I stared at the ticket, the edges soft from how tightly I'd held it, and I realized I didn't want to board the train. Not yet. Maybe not at all. I stood slowly, the suitcase handle cool in my grip, and walked toward the exit. The noise of the station followed me, then thinned as I stepped outside. The air felt clearer there, cooler against my face. I didn't have the answers, not about what I'd done, not about what would come next. But I knew this, running wasn't the answer. Not today. I walked back to the car with the suitcase rolling softly behind me, the unused ticket still clutched in my hand. The paper was bent, the ink smudged from my fingers, but I didn't let it go. Not yet. It wasn't a clean resolution, not a neat choice wrapped in clarity. It was something messier, something harder. But as I opened the car door and slid the suitcase inside, I felt a shift, not an end, not a beginning, but the first flicker of deciding to face what waited at home. The drive back from the station felt heavier than the drive there, though the suitcase was lighter and the ticket sat, unused and wrinkled, on the passenger seat. The roads I'd driven 1,000 times before seemed unfamiliar, as if I were seeing them from some other version of myself. The houses, the trees, even the gas station on the corner, they looked like they belonged to a map I wasn't sure I fit into anymore. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same, exactly as I'd left it. The same chipped paint by the steps, the same curtain slightly askew in the front window. But it felt different, and I couldn't decide if it was the house that had changed or me. I carried the suitcase inside and set it down just inside the doorway, not even bothering to unpack. The weight of it felt symbolic somehow, everything I'd been carrying, everything I'd tried to leave behind, sitting right there on the floor. The living room was quiet, only the faint hum of the clock on the wall breaking the silence. My husband wasn't home yet. His coat was gone from the hook by the door, his mug still rinsed and drying by the sink, a faint sign that he'd been here and gone again. I stood in the center of the room, not moving, letting the stillness settle. The suitcase handle felt cold under my palm as I held it, then let go. I thought about the ticket again, the act of buying it, the act of holding it so tightly, the act of walking away. I thought about what that meant, that I had been ready to leave, but I hadn't. That I had almost stepped onto that train, but I hadn't. I thought about him too, the young man with the easy smile and the voice that had changed the tone of my days. I thought about the night, about the morning after, about how quietly he had left. There was no anger in those memories, no bitterness, but there was an ending. I knew, standing there, that he wouldn't be coming back. Not because of anything said outright, but because of what hadn't been said. There was no dramatic farewell, no sharp break, only the quiet certainty that some things burn brightly and then are simply gone. I walked into the kitchen and opened the window. The cool air pushed in, carrying the smell of damp earth and distant rain. It felt cleansing in a way, brushing against my face, stirring the loose pages on the counter. The guilt hadn't vanished, it still lived in me, sharp and undeniable. But it felt different now, less like a weight pressing me down, more like a scar forming over a wound. Something that would never disappear entirely, but that wouldn't always hurt this much. When my husband came home later, he placed his keys on the counter the way he always did. He didn't notice the suitcase at first. Or maybe he did and chose not to say anything. He asked about dinner, his tone steady, almost practiced. I answered softly, words simple, not an explanation, not a confession. Just a thread of conversation, enough to keep the air from being entirely still. As the evening settled, I unpacked the suitcase, not because I planned to use any of what I had packed, but because it felt like an act of grounding. Each sweater folded back into place. Each item returned. Each movement small but certain. Later, I sat by the window. The sky was dark, the street quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car. The air from the open window felt cooler now, almost sharp, but I didn't close it. I thought about how different I felt sitting there, how different the same chair, the same window, the same life looked. I hadn't left. Not on the train, not for good. But I hadn't stayed the same either. I had made choices, some I couldn't undo. I had broken pieces of myself and found others I didn't know were still there. The house was still my house. The man I was married to was still my husband. But nothing inside me was untouched. I breathed in the night air and closed my eyes. It wasn't relief I felt exactly, it wasn't as neat as that. It was something quieter, something harder to name. Not an ending. Not a beginning. But the first step toward learning how to live with all of it.